but I have numerous goals and I'm not giving up on any of them. A comment I hear fairly frequently. So we're going to talk about how to achieve multiple goals fast. We're going to be using the plane and an advanced version of this. Now, the problem. You have multiple goals you want to progress, but you don't want to give up on any one of them. So you end up trying all of them and getting overwhelmed or burnt out. So these are common mistakes I see around this area. Repeatedly overcommitting to deliverables, professional, personal, social. So sometimes you have multiple ones in professional or one of each. Someone's trying to increase their social life as well as working on a side business. Yep. Starting multiple projects at the same time. Now, this is actually an easy trap to fall into due to how your motivation cycles come and go in your life. When you have this fast burn motivation, you have a tendency to want to fix all areas of your life. And the last one is not stopping to think about what is on your plate right now and realizing that you're actually juggling quite a few things. And then you only stop when your body tells you to, when you get burnt out. So the objectives here, I'm going to help give you a system that will get all of your projects off the ground without getting the burnout. And it will give each of your projects the highest chance of success. If you do this well, not only do you get to work on all of your projects, but you give them the best chance of success. How do successful people seem to juggle multiple projects? So this is something I used to wonder. I looked around, and some people I knew, they had multiple businesses, and they had very good health and fitness, and they just seemed to have everything together. And I was kind of thinking, how on earth are they doing that? I can't even get one thing off the ground. So many exploit the system I'm about to show you. So, but before that, a quick question for you. How many people are in the air right now? And we're talking on planes around the world. Have a little think about that. Take a few seconds to guess. Throw me a number. 1.5 million people, approximately. It would look like this times 1,000. Lots of people in the air. Sometimes I think about this, it's pretty crazy. But we don't get them all in the air at the same time, do we? These are the planes that take off. We take them off. 162 passengers on board a plane. One by one, the planes take off. Most meaningful projects or life quests, and this is now talking about you, they demand significant effort, focus and concentration. Most people go wrong by trying to do too many things at once. It would be like trying to get the 1.5 million people in the air all at the same time. It's not possible. There are not enough runways around the world to do that. I know in London, in the UK, I think it's Heathrow. Every minute a new plane goes off, leaves a runway. So it's like a conveyor belt into the sky. Now this is the principle we're going to be using here. So how do we achieve multiple goals? I call this kind of system here front-loaded energy curves. This is something that was introduced to me by a mentor of mine. And I actually held a lot of resistance to this internally. It's a bit of a being honest here. I actually was very reluctant to accept what he was saying to me at this point. But over the next year or so after this is quite a few years ago, I learned the hard way what happens when you don't do this. So let's explain this. The energy curve. We sometimes think, okay, I just need to put a load of willpower into this. If I spend 100% of my energy on this, I'll never work on other projects. So that's the problem. That's one of the problems we experience. If I need to get this plane off the ground, this project, when am I going to focus on my fitness? When am I going to focus on my social life? When am I going to focus on this other project, on my work? And the other alternative is, okay, I'll do 2 minutes a day or 5 minutes a day. And you'll think, well, that's never going to get this project off the ground. And I'd say that they'll also be right. So you come to a conclusion that I'll just ramp up. But it just continues over time. And so what you will say is ramping up means I'll have less space to do other things later. So there's this finite amount of energy you need, or your willpower, to work on it. So if you focus on, say, your fitness, that's the only thing you'll be focusing on. But the reality is quite different. Now, this is from my experience, and when I mapped this to clients, we found the same thing happened. So I'd say it's fairly reliable, but you can try it and follow this concept yourself, and you see whether it works. The idea here is when you start something new, the amount of perceived effort you have to put in is very high. It rises very rapidly at the beginning. It feels like it's the only thing that you can focus on. And so what happens is the initial period comes here, and the amount of energy input you need to put in is very high. So you end up with this very steep rise and then a peak. And what happens is over time, as you get used to it and you start understanding what you're doing and things become more familiar and you start to build habits, what happens is a lot of the reason it feels so difficult is it's all consciously driven. You're having to think very specifically about what to do. As those actions start to transfer into your unconscious side of your mind, i.e. it feels like second nature, the perceived effort starts to fall away. It drops. And so you end up with this lump at the beginning, and then over time it slowly subsides as it beds into your habit. It doesn't go to zero because you still have to think a little bit about it, but it drops significantly. So here, this is where the habit formation period comes in. So just to give you an example, when you've started a new job, the amount of cognitive load that you experience is really high at the beginning. You don't know who to ask for what, where the departments are, how the systems of the business work. So you're trying to do your job and you can't even, it's very difficult to do because you're having to focus on all the other things. They're all conscious. What happens after maybe 1 or 2 months? You understand all of those things and they all bed into your subconscious, and then you can focus on what you need to do. And so the load drops away. So what happens? So this is essentially what the effort feels like. It's very front loaded. But most people, they get to the top, and if you're working on your own project, if you're working in a job, you are forced to go through this curve, and then you experience it. But when you're working on your own projects, you can stop this at any time, and this is a failure point, right? So most people get to the top, they experience this immense amount of effort, and they think this is not sustainable, and so they fall just before the effort curve starts to fade away, and say, that was exhausting and completely unsustainable. This bit is always hard. So here I'm saying your brain is a prediction engine. So if you keep going to this peak and falling, the last thing your brain remembers is just this. It just thinks that it's going to be this forever. It's extrapolating, and the more times you experience it, the more you embed that belief. But if you just hang in there, keep doing what you're doing, it beds in. So with the job example, you start to know who to phone for what department, where everything is, how all of the systems work. Eventually, you don't have to think about it anymore. And then you can fall down the front-loaded energy curve and get to a place where it doesn't require so much energy. Habit starts to embed in your mind. You become things become unconscious processes. Effort experienced drops significantly. So Now, mapping this to what we showed you earlier, the plane analogy, this is the bit that we're talking about. If you've ever been on a plane, hopefully you have, you experienced this. It is, everyone is focusing in this period of time. It's pretty intense, and if you're not a very good flyer, it's even worse. Even as a passenger, you're having to concentrate, even though you're not flying the plane. But the pilots, air traffic control, runway, everything is focused on getting the plane off the ground. Very intensive work. So this is mapping these two charts. You've got this period and this period. Okay. Now, how does this work with multiple goals? Like, how does this all relate? The idea is we've got this takeoff window. And what we want to do is we want to give it all of the focus, and we line up the next plane to take off when a first plane is on track. Once it's maybe getting to above the clouds, then you can take off and you can focus on the next one. So what it looks like is this. If you want to be really efficient with this, you give your project, your first plane or project one, that period. You look for signals of things starting to bed in, and then you can start stacking your next plane or getting your next plane ready for takeoff. Project staggering, like this. Now, in reality, of course, it doesn't go to zero, so it does accumulate. But what happens is it's much more manageable because the peaks of energy. So this is, and when we're talking about energy, we're talking about that perceived effort. And if you get to over 100, that's when you just feel exhausted, emotionally, physically. So yeah, it looks like this. This is a framework you can attempt to follow, and I'll tell you how to build this into with your real activities shortly. How does this concept help? It ensures safe takeoff for each plane. If you've only got 100% of energy available, you don't want to be giving 50% to multiple planes, or 2 planes, or 30% for 3. It forces you to reflect on what's required. It forces you to commit to waiting before trying to take off the next plane. So what we're saying here, many planes never make it off the ground. Yeah, unfortunately, people make a lot of errors here by trying to put multiple planes on a runway and trying to take them off at the same time. There's not enough focus on the one that matters. If you find yourself struggling, question whether you are trying to take off too many planes. This is what I see very, very frequently. People trying to stack multiple planes at the same time, or roughly around the same time. Again, when you look at it on paper, it doesn't seem to make any sense why anyone would choose to do this. But from an emotional and motivational perspective, it makes a lot of sense, because if you've had a period, like a life slump, and you're stuck in a rut, when you suddenly feel like I've hit rock bottom, I need to change everything, there is a tendency to want to get everything right now, because it's very painful and you want to resolve it. And so we very quickly stack multiple areas. This is very common at during the new year. So when everyone sets their New Year's resolutions, this is one of the reasons why they all fail, because they try and do too many things at the same time. And by February, everyone's burnt out. February comes about here, the peak. So, and this is what happens. You end up with lots of planes crashing on the runway. Don't be a hero, okay? You've probably tried anyway and seen what happens as a result. And remember, you can still get 1.5 million people in the air by sequentially taking planes off. Look at all of the successful people. Now, I've done a fair amount of research on this. You do it yourself if you need further convincing. Successful people are incredibly good at stacking planes. They do so efficiently that it looks like they were juggling all of them at the same time, but they were not. You can get many planes in the air, but you need patience, and you need to be fairly disciplined to refrain from working on the other planes at the same time. Get the first plane off, do it well, and then you can get the next one off pretty soon. It must be within your airport capacity. Now, sometimes you can have one runway airport, and it really is only one thing. The reality is, like real airports, you have multiple runways. You just can't take the 747s off or the A380s off on multiple runways at the same time. You might want to take a big plane off, and you can take a small plane off at the same time. Think about, is your runway clear? Ensure safe altitude before moving to the next one. And this will mean you have to let go of projects frequently. So we talked about this client, Carlos, earlier. He had all of these goals, if you remember: fitness, nutrition, relationships, business, investment. We identified how big his planes were, some much bigger than he was willing to admit. He said, I should be able to do this. That word, should, right? We need to get rid of that out of your vocabulary. So Carlos was struggling with this quite a bit, and he was not willing to accept how big his planes were for him, right? For someone else, it might be a smaller plane, but for him, it was quite a big one, especially things like fitness, nutrition, and the business side, actually, and relationships, right? So we sequenced them for quick wins. We looked at ways to take his planes off such that we could gain confidence and then upwards provide a positive spiral for motivation. Now this really varies from person to person. So for him, we looked at taking some small planes off first. What did that do? Using the plane analogy, it was like giving air traffic control confidence that they can get planes off into the air. Imagine that this is like a new airport. Meanwhile, we were prepping the big planes to take off. And he started to see he was able to get these small planes off, which sometimes took only a week or 2 weeks. We defined the runway the planes needed, and we had to sacrifice some other areas. So, for example, we ended up having to park the nutrition side because that was a really difficult. It proved to be much more difficult than he thought, and even I thought at the time. And we worked on some of the smaller ones. So we worked on some fitness, and we worked on building some relationships. And this is to do with kind of family, friends, and all of that side. Now, small planes first, massive shift in self-belief. So if you remember from the previous module, we talked about how he really struggled with getting any planes off. They just keep crashing. And he had a lot of help from various places: personal trainers, therapists, instructors, and coaches. And it wasn't working for him. Now, we identified what we believed was the cause here. And anyway, with all of these planes that have crashed in the past, the brain, the prediction engine, had a lot of evidence stacked that his airport was pretty useless, not able to get planes off the ground. So we approached it by trying to take off some small planes first. This proved that his airport was able to take some planes off. It was kind of airworthy, let's say. Then it was much easier to work on the big planes. So this was a really big dream of his for about 7 years or so. He just thought, I need to turn my life around. And he kept falling into the trap of trying to, when he'd crashed and burned all these planes, a few months go past, and then he goes through the whole cycle again and then crashes a whole load of new planes. It was very difficult to hold him back to focus on just one or two. But we managed to do it, and then we eventually managed to get some of the bigger planes off. We're now scaling some of his goals. We're now scaling to goals he thought he'd never be able to do. So these are some really big, lofty goals. He's already moved country now, and he's already speaking a new language, and that's only after kind of 6 months, which is really cool. He'd been wanting to try and learn a new language for a very, very, very long time, and there was a lot of questioning. There was a lot of self-doubt about his own ability to stay disciplined with that, but we were able to work on that. Now, questions to ask yourself: how many planes are you trying to take off? Do you realistically have capacity for taking off the number of planes you have? How long will it take for each of your planes? How many different planes do you want to take off? What makes sense for the order of planes? And what is optimal? Now, you don't have to think of all of, you don't have to give very detailed answers to these questions, but these questions will just help break it down. It will make you become more aware of your situation and help realize it. So let's pick an example. What makes sense for the order of planes. When I was working with Carlos, we were trying to figure out what would make sense to. We needed to build his motivation and his confidence. That was quite key. So facing the big planes was just too much for him to handle. And from a tactical perspective, it would take quite a few weeks before we would start seeing any feedback. It was too long. And there was a high risk that his confidence would, it was so low, he would stop halfway through takeoff. So we focused on launching some small planes to complete the cycle, to give him the positive rocks we talked about in the belief section, to plant the seed that he could actually change. Now, I've noticed this is wildly different for different people. So you have to there is an element of figuring out what makes sense for you. Again, if you have any kind of further questions on this, contact me or jump in the community. Right, key points. It's possible to achieve multiple goals, but how to take them off is important. Most meaningful projects require dedication, effort, and concentration. Please don't underestimate this. Pay respect to what you are trying to work on. Not just intentionally, right? You actually have to create the space for them in the real world. Side note on this, number of times I see people planning to work on their projects at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. after a full day of everything else, and they're expecting the most meaningful thing that's going to potentially change their life into, and then living in a really fulfilling situation, they leave till 11 p.m. at night. Think about that. Are you actually respecting what you're trying to go for in practice? Anyway, we'll carry on. Many are trying to juggle too many projects or tasks. This is kind of a fundamental thing. You wouldn't leave it till 10 or 11 at night if you had less things in your day. Most underestimate the energy required to start something. To get a project off the ground, consider the front-loaded energy curve. So from this module, I just want you to imagine that curve where it looks like, let's try and draw it, use my finger. It's a lump at the beginning. It peaks quite early. It can be very painful. The perceived level of effort is high. Yeah. And it's usually uncomfortable and sometimes painful. But it will slowly fade away. So I want you to remember that. This is what I took away when I spoke to my mentor, and it was just burned into my brain. Eventually, it allowed me to let go of some of the other things I was working on. It gets easier once you pass the initial peak. So once you get into that habit phase, you can work on the next thing. It's okay. Stagger projects like planes on a runway. So these are the visuals, the front-loaded energy curve, and then stacking planes on a runway. I always think about this when I'm on a plane and you're taxiing there and the pilot is telling you we're waiting for other planes to take off. We're delayed by half an hour. We have to wait for the next plane to be cleared. Then we are clear for takeoff. We just need to wait for this plane to get safely into the air. This is the same thing. I'm waiting for a project to get into the air. Looking for signs that it is on track. Now we can take off the next project. I do this all the time now, and I get all of my clients to do this. And we see massive results when we do this. Worksheets. So here, This will talk you through how to do it. So if you're feeling a bit confused and a bit overwhelmed by this module, this training, open the worksheet and just focus, like blinkers. Focus on the question, on question 1, and then just write some words in the answer box, and then work through each question. And I've also got a cheat sheet. If you get stuck on a question, read the cheat sheet, and there'll be some examples from other clients. This is a little bit of an additional point. Airplane use cases. The plane concept can be used to help in problematic areas of your life. Here are some examples. So this is a bit of an extra point. That a client of mine said this would be really useful to to include in your course, and to include in telling people, because this is how I have used it. And so, monitoring self-progress in multiple areas. So I used to do an altitude check with, firstly, this specific client who told me this, and he used to say, yep, we're at 38,000 feet and we're good. Oh, the plane has hit some turbulence and we're now dropping at 28,000 feet, right? So I would get it's like a progress or an update check on where areas that he was working on, how they're doing. And I rolled this out to more people, and it didn't resonate with everyone, but it resonated with some. So especially, and I actually worked with a pilot, and he really liked working on this. People who like vehicles, like airplanes, usually resonated with this more, and others didn't. You decide. Now, deciding what tasks I can manage today. Another thing I used to do with some clients is, okay, what are you in the mood for today? What planes can we take off? And we would just talk about, okay, I've got 5 planes ready to go. I'm going to get these planes off. And then we just list them and we get those off. Big plane. We'll park that till tomorrow and we'll do that one then. But these small planes, they need to go. Let's get them up. As expected, after a few planes have been taken off, sometimes big plane shuffles up and we're ready to take off in the afternoon. Why? One, it feels really, really good when you get some planes off the ground. Air traffic control gets nice and confident, and they can get ready to take the next lot off. Lastly, how to prioritize when you've got too many things happening. Yeah, you just think about, okay, how many runways have I got? Some of them are closed for maintenance. I have only one runway to this week. I would see this with some clients who have really busy day jobs, and they have a big project to do over the next 2 weeks. So it's like the whole airport is occupied. We've only got one spare airport, so we need to be very selective of which planes we take off. Okay, so now some client stats and observations. Often find clients who are continuously dealing with multiple big planes on the runway all the time and wondering why they couldn't get anything off the ground. Typically need to remove 3 or more planes. Now, I generally work with a lot of people who are fairly ambitious and want to achieve a lot in their life. Unfortunately, this can work against them when we look at the runway situation. So every time I radio in, they've somehow got 3 or 4 planes on the runway at any one time. So we do need to do quite a bit of removal. Side note, this is often a cause of burnout. This system is a practical way to relieve burnout. It's nearly like a logical system that you can do. You can look at it, and the reason I use the plane situation is what I've found is when we talk about tasks and projects, it becomes a bit too academic. But when you think about planes, now you can use any variation of this. When you think about planes, you can nearly visualize these planes, and you're just looking at it and you're saying, oh, why have I got 3 planes all trying to crowd this one runway, and there's one massive plane on there. It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes it's defined projects. Other times it's lifestyle social activities. Yeah, okay, right. So what we're talking about here is someone would say, I've only got this one project I'm working on the side. Then I would say, okay, what else is going on? And I find out they have incredibly busy social schedule. They're meeting up with friends. They're going out. They've got these networking events. They've got lots of hobbies on the go. Or they're working on this, that. These are what I sometimes call the hidden planes. It varies from person to person. If people don't see those things as projects, they feel like they're hidden. You don't realize that there are planes essentially just, it's like, imagine you've got these little private jets that are still taking off on your runway and haven't really told air traffic control, and you're wondering why the big plane can't take off. Well, it's because it's seeing planes in front of it all the time. In practice, this is what I have found quite useful for a lot of clients, which is having one big plane on the go and at least one small plane always working. This has proved to be fairly optimal for a few reasons. A big plane means that you're going to have a nice new trajectory for your life in some way. It's going to be very fulfilling. The problem is that it requires you to be often in the right mind space to make some progress. The small plane allows you to get confidence that you can get things off the ground. And if you are having a particularly low mood day or week, you can focus on the small plane and it still feels like progress. And sometimes when you see the small plane take off, it gives you this burst of motivation that helps you get started with the big plane. Yeah. Those that work on one plane alone nearly always get the plane up. Yeah, this is what I've seen as well. If I see someone who's got a really big plane and they just cannot make any progress, I will help them clear out everything, and it's quite forcefully as well. And this is the only thing you're going to concentrate for these next couple of days. We'll check in later. You have to be quite militant with this, and I tend to like doing this quite a bit because a lot of people struggle with this, and the return on investment of this is very high. Because if we can get a plane into the air, it breeds hope, and then if we can get you to cruise altitude, well, we are off and away. Once one plane is up, often we're able to get 5 to 8 planes up over 3 months cruise altitude. Yeah, so this is a interesting metric for those who are trying to wonder how useful this is in the long term. I wondered this early on, but I noticed this. Even people who had not managed to get any planes up for years, once we consistently implemented this approach, after about 3 to 6 months, we would get upward of 5 to 10 planes in the air. So each plane represents a different area or domain in your life. So this can be a side business, a new hobby, better relationships with family, friends and partners, better social circles, okay? Better financial management, time management. Some personal stats observations now. This was a crucial concept for me. It still is. Always at risk of too many planes. This is probably one of my personal vulnerabilities. I'm a bit of a plane collector. That's why I've got all of these. Again, I will remind you, these systems were all designed for me first. So I have this system because I need it. I find I can only actually manage one plane at a time. I can make one big plane and one small plane work. But if I have a really big plane, I need to allocate everything to that one plane. So that's like no going out on the weekends or no activities. I find it very difficult. I spend time and energy to clear the runway. Yeah, so I will go through my calendar and try and scrub everything until I've got like a blank calendar. If I can. If I can't, then I will look at ways to clear it for very short periods of time. Sweet spot is 1 month of a runway to get a big plane off. So I will sometimes allocate, like August to getting a plane off, or November to getting a plane off, or December, etc. Okay. Smaller planes, typically 1 week. If I need to get my nutrition or my fitness back up together. Now I'm pretty well practiced at those two, so they are fairly small planes for me now. It just requires me a week of concentration, and I can get those up, kind of up and running. If I want to start a new hobby, it's kind of in between. Social friends often affect major planes. This is a bit of a painful one. Personally, for me, I'm okay with this now, but a lot of clients I see report this, that the sacrifice. Well, sorry. Firstly, the effect that socializing with friends, family in the evenings and all weekend, it affects the ability to take planes off, for sure. I often have to clear my diary and tell friends social I'm off limits for this weekend or these weeknights. You must take this seriously if the plane is important to you. This goes back to focus and sacrifices. If you're not making sacrifices, the goal you're trying to hit probably doesn't matter as much as you thought it did, and you might want to reconsider that. If it does, you should be making sacrifices. Where we are. Okay, so we've made a lot of progress here. So, created space, time, and energy we will need to execute. Language. Front-loaded energy curve. That's quite a mouthful. If you've got a better name, hit me up. But just want you to remember that shape, right? The big lump at the beginning, and then it fades. Energy curves. Takeoff window. Think about when a plane is trying to take off, all of the focus and concentration is on getting that plane off the ground. Radioing in. Pilots, air traffic control. Everything is organized to get that plane off the ground. Project staggering. Think about, are you trying to juggle too many things? I catch myself doing this inadvertently quite frequently, even to this day. About 6 months ago, I had multiple projects on the go, and I had to do a review, and I was like, what am I doing here? I'm trying to take off 2 planes on the same runway. Get rid of stuff. Again, I would mention that I wound back on social media at the beginning of this year to write lots of education content. I wanted to keep all of that going, but I realized my brain just really struggled managing the 2 things at the same time. So I sacrificed that and went into cave mode and writing mode. Okay, so we are here. Next up, overcoming the fear of failure. So we are getting very, very close now. Prep is now nearly done. This is a big one. Look forward to seeing you in the next module.